Here I'm going to talk about some of the ethics of torture, which of course is a difficult subject. And you might think, it's sort of straightforwardly obvious that torture is never ethically justified. But Henry Shue has this fairly interesting argument uh, that at least torture is possibly justified. That is, it's sort of theoretically justifiable. But he does then go on to conclude that it's almost never actually justifiable. That is, given sort of the realities of any kind of a situation where somebody might be considering that torture could be justified, the facts of the situation make it clear that it actually is not justified. But in any case, just the fact that he could come up with a theoretical justification for torture is interesting enough. And so there's some interesting applied ethics going on here. And Henry Shue is a very well-known applied ethicist. He has really kind of famous works in a lot of different areas of applied ethics. So let's see what he's got. So he starts off his essay in a way that's similar to other philosophers in applied ethics, that he considers an argument that he dramatically disagrees with, just to kind of show how people think about this and how people's thinking maybe goes wrong before he presents his own arguments. So maybe you've heard something like this before. And of course, we're assuming here that there is such a thing as justified warfare. So for example, protecting your country against hostile invasion could potentially be justified war. So we're not talking about unjustified aggression, territory taking, or resource taking, or anything like that, or genocide, or any of those kinds of unjustified types of warfare. So assuming that the war is justified in the first place, then here comes this argument. So killing is worse than torture. Killing is justified within justified war. If a bad action is justified under some particular circumstances, then a less bad action is also justified under those circumstances. So therefore, torture is justified within warfare. So maybe you can think of some premises here, 1, 2, or 3, that you disagree with. Some people might say, well, is killing really worse than torture? At least we get from fictional accounts, television shows and movies, when somebody's being tortured, they might ask to just be killed instead of continuing to endure this torture. It seems like there's potentially some truth to that, that killing could be, or being killed could be preferable to being tortured. But of course, that depends on the kind of torture and the duration and so on. What Henry Shue focuses on is premise 3 here. And it's not at all clear that just because a certain kind of otherwise bad action is justified in particular circumstances, that any other bad actions that are considered to be less than that original bad action are automatically justified. So, if killing is justified under certain circumstances, then you just have sort of a blank check, right? You can do whatever you want as long as it's less bad than killing. Now, that doesn't seem plausible. Just because a particular kind of killing is justified or any other bad action is justified, it does not automatically justify sort of this giant range of other actions that are less bad. So for example, just because killing could be justified during warfare, that doesn't automatically justify theft in warfare or other kinds of assault during warfare. So this argument just doesn't seem like it's really working. And so that's why I've got it in parentheses here. This is a bad argument. Okay, so Henry Shue then takes this very different kind of approach and starts his reasoning on torture during warfare by thinking first about the difference between soldiers and civilians. So during a theoretically justified war, it could be justified to kill sort of the opposing soldiers, right, the enemy soldiers, but that does not justify killing enemy civilians or any civilians, whether you consider them enemies or not. And Shue believes, I think he's got a good case here, that the key difference between soldiers and civilians is that soldiers are not defenseless, right? They have weapons, they have fortifications of various kinds. Maybe they're outmatched by their opponents, but nevertheless, they have some means of defending themselves. And also they are potential aggressors, right? So they're still in the fight, as opposed to civilians that are completely defenseless, right? They have no way to defend themselves physically. They have no way to stop the attack by sort of fighting back or pushing back on their own. So they're just, as we say, sitting ducks, right? They're just going to get killed by these forces coming in. So this is why Henry Shue thinks that it could potentially be justified to kill enemy soldiers, but it's not justified to kill civilians. So how can anybody, right, especially soldiers and that we're focusing on now, how can they defend themselves? Well, the obvious way is to fight back. But if they're fighting back, if they're sort of still engaging in the battle, then, of course, assuming this is justified warfare, then it is potentially justified to continue fighting them, right? You can continue trying to kill them if they're trying to kill you. The other way to stop the opponents from attacking you is to surrender. You know, you throw down your weapons, you throw up the white flag, and you say, "Okay, I'm done. I'm not fighting anymore." So if the opponents are continuing to fight, then it's potentially justified to continue trying to kill them. But if they surrender, then continuing to attack them is not justified. They are now officially defenseless, very much like the civilians. And as he believes himself to have established already, if the people you're looking at are defenseless, then it is not justified to continue attacking them. Okay, so where does sort of torture come back into the picture here? So he thinks, as far as surrendered soldiers or captured soldiers from the opposing army, yes, they've surrendered in terms of throwing down their actual weapons, but there might be this other sense of surrender that's going on. Let's move on to this one. Yeah, that if the captured soldiers have information that could be useful for helping to win this battle or win this war, then there's this other argument here that could kick in, that continuing to attack them in the form of torture in this case could potentially be justified in a way that's similar to attacking them as justified when they're actually holding their weapons still and they're physically fighting back. And the idea is that they have this further means of surrender. That is, they could surrender the information that they have. And if they surrender the information that they have, then that's similar to giving up your weapons. It will stop any further attack in the form of torture. So there's this extra kind of surrender in addition to throwing down your weapons that the soldiers could engage in, which is surrendering information. So this would be considered interrogational torture. And so Henry Shue thinks that he's got at least kind of a narrow justification, a potential justification for interrogational torture, because you're dealing with a soldier who's in a situation that's similar to when the soldier was actually fighting. When the soldier is actually fighting, you're justified in continuing to attack them until they surrender. They stop fighting, but here they've got information rather than guns, and so you can continue to attack them until they surrender the information. And as soon as they surrender the information, they are now defenseless. They have no other things to sort of give to you or signals to provide to show that they are completely defenseless. And so they, in fact, are now officially fully defenseless, and continuing to attack them is no longer justified. Okay, so like I said, seems like potentially a narrow justification of interrogational torture. And so it's useful at this point to mark this distinction, which Henry Shue does in his essay, between interrogational torture and terroristic torture. So he thinks he's got this potential justification for interrogational torture because the victim has a defense. As long as they surrender the information, that officially stops the attack. Any further attack would be unjustified, as opposed to terroristic torture, which is always unjustified. It's not done to get information. The victim has no way of stopping it. There's nothing that they can do to their torturer or give to their torturer to stop the torture, because the whole point of terroristic torture is just to inflict suffering in order to sort of intimidate or to create terror, right? And so it's not about trying to get something from the person that's being tortured. It's just simply to inflict suffering and sort of assert your authority somehow over the person that's suffering here. The person that's being subjected to terroristic torture is already completely defenseless. And so, according to the reasoning that Henry Shue has going on in this essay, there's no way to justify that kind of torture. Okay. So, even though Henry Shue believes that he has some potential justification for at least interrogational torture, this is, as we call it, sort of a theoretical justification, kind of under some kind of maybe hypothetical, idealized circumstances. He doesn't think it's ever actually justified because the facts of any actual case show that even interrogational torture can never really be justified. So there's a variety of problems. One of them is that once you have somebody captured, a captured soldier, and you think they might have information that you could use, and so you're thinking of engaging in interrogational torture to get them to give up the information, how do you know for sure that they really have the information versus they're just ignorant, right? They just don't have that information because presumably if somebody has information that they are reluctant to give up, the first thing that they'll do is say, I don't have the information you're looking for. So I don't have the information you're looking for is exactly the thing that somebody would say if they do have the information or if they don't have the information. So how do you know which is which? How do you know if they're lying or not? And so there's kind of this slippery slope of like, well, I think they're maybe lying. So just one more minute of torture and maybe then they'll give up the information and stop claiming that they're ignorant. Well, okay, but maybe they really are ignorant and you're just torturing them unjustifiably. That's obviously a big problem. Then there's this further problem that, in fact, people being tortured will just say whatever they think that the torturer wants to hear in order to stop the torture. And so there's no way to be sure that they, even if they do give up information, that it's good information. And just that it seems that this is a clear case, just in actual cases of torture, that this is not a very reliable way of getting good information out of people. That it seems there's good evidence that reliable information can be gotten from somebody without torturing them. That there's other ways of getting information that's actually much more effective and much more justifiable. It doesn't involve this kind of heavy suffering. There are a couple of other possible reasons why it's unjustified, even interrogational torture, and even under sort of ideal circumstances where you think the person really does have the information, like it's really obvious that they have the information you're looking for, even then it could be unjustifiable to continue torturing them. So for one thing, it's a little bit different for a surrendering soldier to just simply put down their weapons and say, okay, you got me, take me prisoner, versus then turning around and actually giving up information that you can use to go and kill their friends. So that seems like a deeper betrayal of their own comrades, their own fellow soldiers, to give up that kind of information that will let you go kill their friends. That's a deeper betrayal than just simply giving up and throwing down your weapons and allowing yourself to be captured. So perhaps that's one more reason, right, to say that even interrogational torture maybe isn't fully justified. Plus, maybe it's hard to have sympathy for the person engaging in the torture, doing the torture, but nevertheless, there can be really serious psychological scars left by somebody who is required to torture prisoners. That can have a very, very detrimental effect on their own sort of humanity and their own virtue and their own well-being, could be forever lost if they are somebody who's engaging in torture. So there's that. That's obviously a negative consequence that has to be taken into account. And then just the regulation of torture. How do you make sure it doesn't get out of control? And we have plenty of examples throughout history where it seemed like maybe a little bit of duress, some like tough interrogation techniques seemed justified, but then that just escalates and escalates and escalates until finally we're engaging in what really amounts to terroristic torture instead of anything remotely resembling a justifiable interrogational torture. Okay, so that's probably enough, so I'll go ahead and stop there. Thanks.